Imagine you are trying to solve a multi-step math word problem, the kind you might remember from grade school. You read it, you break it down into pieces, you work through each piece, and then you arrive at an answer. Now imagine asking a language model to do the same thing, but instead of walking through those intermediate steps, it just jumps straight to a final number. That jump is where things go wrong for even the largest language models. This paper, authored by Jason Wei, Denny Zhou, and colleagues at Google Research's Brain Team, investigates a deceptively simple idea. What if you just showed the model a few examples of that step-by-step thinking, and it learned to do it on its own? The challenge here is fundamental. Large language models, or LLMs, have made enormous strides across natural language tasks by scaling up parameters and training data. Models like GPT-3, LaMDA, and PaLM can do impressive things with just a few examples provided in the prompt, a technique called few-shot prompting. But when it comes to tasks that require genuine multi-step reasoning, like arithmetic word problems, common-sense inference, or symbolic manipulation, simply making models bigger hasn't been enough. The scaling curve for these reasoning tasks is essentially flat under standard prompting. You go from a model with 8 billion parameters to one with 540 billion, and accuracy on a math word problem benchmark barely budges. Before this work, there were two main camps trying to address reasoning in language models. The first camp focused on training or fine-tuning models on datasets where each example included not just the answer, but also intermediate reasoning steps, sometimes called rationales. This approach, pioneered by Ling and colleagues and extended by Cobb and others, works well, but is expensive because you need large curated datasets of step-by-step solutions. The second camp relied on few-shot prompting, which is cheap and flexible since you just show the model a handful of input-output examples at inference time with no training needed. But standard few-shot prompting gives the model no scaffolding for reasoning. It sees a question, sees a final answer, and tries to mimic that pattern. For simple factual lookups, this works, but for multi-step problems, it falls apart. The key insight of this paper is that you can combine the best of both worlds, keep the lightweight few-shot prompting setup, but augment each example with a chain of thought, a series of intermediate natural language reasoning steps that lead to the answer. No fine-tuning, no new training data pipelines, no architectural changes. You just write better prompts. So what does chain of thought prompting actually look like in practice? Instead of a prompt that says, question, Roger has 5 tennis balls, he buys 2 more cans with 3 balls each. How many does he have? Answer, 11. You write, Roger started with 5 balls, 2 cans of 3 tennis balls, each is 6 tennis balls, 5 plus 6 equals 11. The answer is 11. That is the entire intervention. You compose roughly 8 such exemplars with chains of thought, prepend them to your test question, and let the model generate. The model, having seen the pattern of step-by-step reasoning in the prompt, produces its own chain of thought for the new question before arriving at a final answer. Think of it like showing a student a few worked examples in a math textbook before asking them to solve a new problem on their own. The worked examples don't teach new knowledge so much as they demonstrate a problem-solving process the student can imitate. The authors test this on a wide array of benchmarks. For arithmetic reasoning, they use 5 datasets including GSM-8K, a challenging benchmark of grade school math word problems, along with SVAMP, ASDIV, AQA, and MAY-WPS. For common sense reasoning, they use common sense QA, strategy QA, date understanding, sports understanding, and a robotics instruction dataset called SAY-CAN. For symbolic reasoning, they devise 2 toy tasks: last letter concatenation, where you take the last letter of each word in a name and string them together, and coin flip, a state tracking task. They evaluate across 3 major model families: GPT-3, at multiple sizes, up to 175 billion parameters, LaMDA up to 137 billion parameters, and PaLM at 8 billion, 62 billion, and 540 billion parameters. The results are striking. On GSM-8K, PaLM 540B with just 8 chain-of-thought exemplars achieves state-of-the-art accuracy, surpassing even a fine-tuned GPT-3 175B model that used a specialized verifier. On SVAMP and MAWPS, chain of thought prompting with PayLM 540B also sets new state-of-the-art marks. On commonsense tasks, PayLM 540B with chain of thought prompting beats the prior best on strategy QA, reaching 75.6% versus 69.4%, and on sports understanding it outperforms an unaided human sports enthusiast, 95.4% versus 84%. One of the most important findings is that chain of thought prompting is an emergent ability of model scale. For small models, adding chains of thought to prompts actually hurts performance. Models below roughly 100 billion parameters produce fluent but logically incoherent chains of thought, essentially babbling plausible-sounding but wrong intermediate steps. It is only at the largest scales that the model can reliably follow the logical structure demonstrated in the examples. This is a crucial point. The technique is not universally applicable to any language model. It specifically unlocks capabilities that are latent in very large models. The authors also run a careful ablation study to understand what makes chain of thought prompting work. They test an equation-only variant where the model just outputs a mathematical equation before the answer, a variable compute variant where the model outputs a sequence of dots equal in length to the needed computation, controlling for the hypothesis that it is simply the extra tokens that help, and a chain of thought after answer variant where the reasoning appears after the final answer rather than before it. The equation-only variant helps only on the simplest one-step problems. The dots variant performs no better than standard prompting, ruling out the hypothesis that mere additional computation time is the explanation. And the chain of thought after answer variant also shows no benefit, confirming that the model actually uses the sequential reasoning to derive the answer rather than simply activating relevant knowledge. The real explanatory power comes from expressing intermediate reasoning in natural language before generating the final answer. Robustness is another strength. The authors have 3 different annotators independently write chains of thought for the same exemplars, and they also test with exemplars sampled directly from the GSM-8K training set. While there is some variance across annotators and exemplar choices, as you would expect with any prompting approach, all chain of thought variants substantially outperform standard prompting. The results are also stable across different exemplar orderings and different numbers of exemplars. On symbolic reasoning tasks, the authors observe something particularly interesting. Chain of thought prompting enables a form of length generalization. When few-shot exemplars show chains of thought for 2-word names in the last letter concatenation task, the model can generalize to 3- and 4-word names at test time, something standard prompting completely fails at. Now let us consider what this work does not do. The authors are candid that producing a chain of thought that looks like human reasoning does not prove the model is genuinely reasoning in any deep cognitive sense. The chain of thought is a useful intermediate representation, but we should not mistake surface-level mimicry for understanding. There is also no guarantee that the generated chain of thought is correct. The author's error analysis finds that when PayLM gets the wrong answer on GSM-8K, about 46% of the time, the chain of thought is almost correct, with minor mistakes like arithmetic errors or a single missing step, while the other 54% contain major semantic misunderstandings. This means chain of thought prompting can produce confidently wrong answers with plausible-looking reasoning, which is arguably more dangerous than a model that simply says, "I don't know." And the biggest practical limitation is the scale requirement. If chain of thought reasoning only emerges at 100 billion parameters and above, that puts it out of reach for most deployment scenarios. Serving a 540 billion parameter model is extraordinarily expensive. The paper also does not explore how to distill this reasoning capability into smaller, more deployable models, though the authors flag this as important future work. Looking forward, this paper helped catalyze a wave of follow-up research on prompting strategies for reasoning, including self-consistency, decoding where you sample many chains of thought and take a majority vote over final answers, zero-shot chain of thought prompting, where you simply append "let's think step by step" to a question, and tree of thought methods that explore branching reasoning paths. The fundamental open question remains. As models continue to scale, how much further will reasoning improve, and can these capabilities be made accessible in models small enough to serve at scale? The paper also raises an intriguing philosophical question about what it means for reasoning to be an emergent property of scale, appearing suddenly rather than gradually as models grow. Now let's walk through some questions you might have after hearing all of this. A natural first question is, why does this only work at very large model scales, and what is happening at smaller scales that makes it fail? The authors observe that small models, when prompted with chain-of-thought examples, produce fluent but logically incoherent intermediate steps. Essentially, smaller models have learned to generate text that looks like reasoning, but have not internalized enough about logical structure and arithmetic to actually follow through. It seems that only at very large scales does the model have sufficient latent reasoning capability for the chain-of-thought format to channel productively. Another question you might ask is, if the model is just pattern matching from the few-shot examples, how is this different from giving it a template to fill in? That is exactly the tension at the heart of this work. On the symbolic reasoning tasks, the authors acknowledge that the few-shot exemplars essentially provide a perfect solution template, and the model just needs to apply the same steps with new symbols. But on math and common sense problems, the chain of thought the model generates must handle novel semantic structures not present in the exemplars. The fact that it succeeds on diverse benchmarks with just 8 fixed exemplars suggests something beyond shallow template matching, though how deep that reasoning goes remains genuinely unknown. A third question worth asking is, could you achieve the same effect by fine-tuning a smaller model on chain-of-thought data instead of prompting a huge model? In principle, yes, and that is one of the directions the authors point to as future work. The advantage of chain-of-thought prompting is that it requires no training data collection or fine-tuning at all, just a handful of manually written examples. But if you had the budget to generate or curate a large dataset of reasoning chains, perhaps using a large model to produce them, you could potentially distill that capability into a smaller model through fine-tuning. This is, in fact, what subsequent research has explored, though it remains an active area with open questions about how well reasoning transfers through distillation. For practitioners building large-scale recommendation systems, the ideas in this paper have some intriguing implications, even though the domain seems different at first glance. Recommendation ranking and candidate retrieval increasingly rely on language models, whether through natural language understanding of item descriptions and user queries, or through LLM-based reasoning about user intent. Chain-of-thought prompting suggests that when you need a model to handle multi-step inference, like understanding that a user who searched for hiking boots and then browsed waterproof jackets is likely planning an outdoor trip and might want a camping tent, you can get dramatically better results by structuring your prompts to encourage intermediate reasoning rather than jumping straight to a recommendation score. More practically, as recommendation systems incorporate LLM-based re-rankers or conversational agents that explain why an item was recommended, chain-of-thought style prompting could improve both the quality of the reasoning and the interpretability of the explanation. The catch, of course, is the latency and cost constraint. Chain-of-thought prompting generates many more tokens per inference call, which is at odds with the real-time serving requirements of systems handling billions of requests. The path forward likely involves distilling chain-of-thought reasoning into smaller specialized models or using it selectively for high-value interactions where the added latency is acceptable, such as conversational recommendations or complex query understanding in the re-ranking stage rather than the initial candidate retrieval stage.